The summer of 1998 descended upon Nashville, Tennessee, with a suffocating, unrelenting grip. The air hung heavy and wet over the city, a thick wool blanket that seemed to sap the energy right out of the pavement. Caleb Miller, a 30-year-old junior architect with a quiet intensity, felt the oppressive atmosphere more acutely than most. His mind was constantly elsewhere, occupied not with the rising steel frames of new high-rises, but with the crumbling brickwork of the structures they replaced. He was obsessed with historical preservation, a passion that often made him feel out of sync with his modernizing colleagues. Caleb needed inspiration for a difficult new preservation project he was struggling with. He spent his few off hours scanning the classified section of local newspapers, looking for leads. On one particularly humid weekend, an ad buried deep in the back of the Tennessean caught his eye. It was for an estate sale at an old mansion located on the extreme outskirts of town, along the old Murfreesboro Road. The listing described it as the final sale before the building's imminent demolition. The Eldridge family, who had built the house over a century ago, had finally run out of money. Caleb knew the family name, historically prominent, but now whispered about with pity, generation after generation falling into poverty. They were selling off the last scattered remnants of their past luxury before the wrecking balls arrived. Caleb saw an opportunity, a chance to perhaps salvaging a piece of history. He hoped to find unique interior elements that might be preserved, or, if he was truly lucky, perhaps old architectural blueprints or structural notes hidden in an ignored closet. He grabbed his keys, climbed into his battered Ford pickup, and began the dusty drive out. The destination was difficult to spot at first, set well back from the road behind a thick, unruly wall of overgrown ancient oaks and dense ivy that seemed determined to reclaim the land. Through a break in the trees, the mansion finally appeared in its tragic, dilapidated greatness. It was an imposing Gothic revival structure, its white paint peeling, columns cracked, and some windows broken like blank, staring eyes. Despite the decay, it was grand, commanding attention in its final hours. The massive, rust-covered wrought iron gates were pushed open, inviting the few curious visitors for a final, sad farewell tour. On the front lawn, pathetic plastic fold-out tables were set up, holding assortments of uninteresting household junk, cracked china, boxes of unmatched silverware, and mildewed clothes. A few bargain hunters milled about, picking through the sad remnants. Caleb completely ignored the outdoor tables. The physical gravity of the house pulled him forward. He crossed the overgrown lawn and moved directly toward the cavernous, darkened main entryway, drawn irresistibly inside the building itself. Caleb stepped across the threshold into a cavernous main foyer that immediately overwhelmed his senses with the heavy, stagnant odor of mildew, deteriorating paper, and the unmistakable scent of a long-forgotten era. The grand entrance had been completely stripped of its former glory. Faded, torn wallpaper hung in sad strips from the plaster, and the original hardwood floors were deeply scarred with gouges where massive antique furniture had recently been dragged away to be sold. He wandered slowly through the echoing, empty reception rooms on the ground floor, his footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the desolate space. Pulling a camera from his bag, he meticulously photographed the few architectural treasures that had been left behind, focusing his lens on the intricate surviving plaster ceiling medallions and the ornate hand-carved mahogany wall panels that still clung to the dining room walls. Seeking spaces less picked over by the estate liquidators, Caleb eventually made his way up a grand staircase that transitioned into a much narrower, steeply pitched flight of wooden steps leading to the third floor. This level had clearly served as the servants' quarters, characterized by low ceilings, oppressive heat, and narrow corridors. As he walked down the creaking hallway, scanning the empty, cramped bedrooms, his eyes caught sight of a small, unusually narrow door tucked away in the deepest shadows at the very end of the hall. It was nearly flush with the wall and lacked a proper doorknob, featuring only an old rusted iron keyhole. The door was locked tight, but the wood frame was rotting and the internal mechanism was severely corroded by decades of humidity. Bracing himself against the opposite wall, Caleb drove his shoulder hard into the solid wood. It took 3 heavy, determined impacts before the rusted latch finally shattered with a loud metallic screech, allowing the door to swing inward. Beyond the door lay a steep, narrow set of steps leading directly into the sprawling attic. The air up here was stiflingly hot and thick with airborne debris. Slanting beams of pale sunlight fought their way through the grime of a single small dormer window, illuminating billions of dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. The massive space was a chaotic graveyard of forgotten family history, piled high with disintegrating cardboard boxes, broken wooden chairs with exposed upholstery, and thick, grayish curtains of undisturbed cobwebs draped across the wooden rafters. Caleb carefully navigated his way through the precarious maze of junk, drawn toward the weak pool of light near the dormer window in the far corner. Resting heavily beneath the sloped roof was a massive, antique trunk bound in thick strips of forged black iron. He attempted to pull it toward the light, but the chest was impossibly heavy, anchored to the floorboards by its own immense weight. Brushing a thick layer of gray dust from the curved lid, he grasped the iron handles and pushed upward. Surprisingly, the heavy hasp was not padlocked, and the lid groaned open on stiff hinges. The interior smelled sharply of mothballs and deep decay, filled to the brim with ruined, moth-eaten garments from the 19th century. Caleb began to carefully shift the crumbling fabrics aside, his hands sinking deep into the pile until his fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. He pulled the object free from the tangle of rotting cloth and brought it up into the shafts of sunlight.
It was a dense, heavy drafting tube, crafted from thick, cracked brown leather, capped tightly at both ends. His heart rate began to climb as he worked the stiff leather cap free. Reaching inside, he gently grasped a tight roll of thick, aged vellum and slowly slid it out. Spreading the fragile documents across the flat top of the iron trunk, Caleb froze in absolute awe. Laid out before him was a complete, perfectly preserved set of original architectural blueprints for the very mansion he was standing in. His eyes scanned the precise, elegant line work, landing on the ornate title block in the bottom corner. The dates were clearly marked in the early 1870s, accompanied by the unmistakable, sweeping signature of a highly renowned master architect from that era. For a historical preservationist, this was an unfathomable, priceless treasure, a perfect window into the past that had been sitting untouched in the dark for over a century.
Clutching the heavy leather drafting tube tightly to his chest, as if it were made of fragile glass, Caleb navigated the treacherous, creaking staircases all the way down to the ground floor. He bypassed the remaining sparse clusters of bargain hunters in the foyer and stepped out through the grand front doors into the suffocating humidity of the summer afternoon. His immediate goal was to locate an estate liquidator or an auctioneer to negotiate a fair price for the historical documents he had just unearthed. As he scanned the trampled front lawn, his eyes bypassed the cheap folding tables and settled on a solitary figure seated far away from the chaotic center of the sale. Positioned in the deep, cooling shade of an ancient weeping willow was an elderly woman sitting motionless in a weathered wooden rocking chair. She was dressed entirely in a heavy, archaic black morning gown that seemed completely unsuitable for the sweltering heat. This was Mrs. Eldridge, the final living descendant of the ruined family line, watching the systematic dismantling of her ancestral legacy with an unsettling stillness. Caleb approached her with respectful caution, holding the leather tube out slightly as a gesture of his intention. He politely explained his profession, his deep reverence for the history of the estate, and his strong desire to purchase the architectural plans he had just unearthed in the attic. The frail woman did not immediately respond. Instead, she slowly raised her head and fixed him with a long, unnervingly piercing stare. Her pale eyes held a complex, disturbing mixture of profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a strange, quiet satisfaction, as if she had been waiting for someone exactly like him to arrive. She showed absolutely no interest in discussing money or setting a monetary price for the invaluable artifacts. With a slow, deliberate nod of her head, she communicated her terms in a quiet, raspy voice that barely carried over the sounds of the distant estate sale. The blueprints could be his to keep, entirely free of charge, but only upon the completion of a single, highly specific task. She instructed Caleb to re-enter the mansion and descend directly into the main cellar.
deep within the subterranean darkness, situated on a specific wooden shelf against the far eastern wall, he would find an old heavy metal lockbox. His task was simply to retrieve this box and deliver it directly into her hands. However, her tone shifted, becoming intensely firm and cautionary as she laid out the strict rules of this peculiar errand. She emphasized that the metal container was securely locked and that under no circumstances was he to attempt to open it, pry at the hinges, or even shake it to guess its contents. The ownership of the antique blueprints would transfer to him only the absolute second the untouched metal box was safely in her possession. To Caleb, the bizarre request felt like the irrational, eccentric whim of a grieving old woman clinging to some forgotten family trinket. Yet the allure of the masterful 19th century architectural drawings resting in his hands was far too overpowering to resist, and without a second thought, he readily agreed to her unusual condition.
Caleb stepped back into the suffocating heat of the main hall, carefully securing the leather tube containing the blueprints under his arm. He navigated the debris-strewn foyer until he located a heavy oak door tucked discreetly beneath the belly of the grand staircase. Its brass handle was tarnished black with age and stiff from disuse. Pulling the heavy door open, he was immediately struck by a startling rush of subterranean air. The draft smelled of damp earth, ancient rot, and a profound graveyard cold that stood in sharp, unnatural contrast to the sweltering Tennessee summer radiating outside. He reached for a porcelain rotary light switch mounted on the peeling plaster wall, but the bare bulb hanging high above the stairwell had long since burned out, responding with nothing but a hollow click. Digging into his pocket, he retrieved his metal lighter, striking the flint wheel until a small, flickering orange flame sprang to life. Holding the meager source of light ahead of him, Caleb began the slow descent down the worn, uneven stone steps. The stairs were slick with moisture and dangerously steep. With each downward step he took, the ambient temperature plummeted drastically, and the atmosphere grew unnaturally thick, pressing against his chest and making each breath feel like a physical effort. Reaching the bottom, he realized the basement was a sprawling, cavernous space, far larger than the visible footprint of the house above, and divided into a confusing labyrinth of separate, pitch-black alcoves. The feeble glow of his lighter barely managed to push back the oppressive darkness, only revealing brief, terrifying glimpses of his surroundings. The flame illuminated the skeletal remains of rotting wooden wine racks stretching toward the ceiling, a massive, slumping mound of forgotten coal in one corner, and rusted, unrecognizable iron mechanisms hulking silently in the deep shadows. Maintaining his bearings in the disorienting gloom, he carefully navigated the treacherous, uneven dirt floor, heading steadily and purposefully toward the far eastern wall, exactly as the old woman had instructed.
The silence down in the cellar was absolute and deafening, a heavy, suffocating vacuum that magnified the crunch of grit beneath his boots and the ragged, nervous rhythm of his own breathing. The darkness surrounding him felt almost liquid, constantly threatening to swallow the weak light of his small flame. After several tense minutes of blind navigation through the subterranean maze, the wavering orange light finally reflected off a sagging, heavy wooden shelf bolted directly to the damp, weeping brickwork of the eastern wall. Resting squarely in the center of the rotting wood, buried beneath an incredibly thick layer of undisturbed gray dust, sat a small, formidable metal lockbox. The container was tightly bound in cracked, darkened leather and secured with a faded, brittle ribbon tied in a complex, archaic knot. Caleb reached out his free hand and firmly grasped the object to lift it from its resting place. It was shockingly heavy for its modest size, dragging his arm down with its dense, unnatural mass. Far more alarming than the weight, however, was the temperature. The metal beneath the decaying leather was absolutely freezing, radiating an intense, piercing cold that bit into his skin as if the box were carved from solid, ancient ice. Just as his fingers closed fully around the freezing container, a sudden, inexplicable draft swept through the stagnant air of the cellar. The small flame of his lighter sputtered violently and died out in an instant, plunging him completely into a suffocating, impenetrable blackness.
The sudden, absolute extinguishment of the small flame plunged Caleb into a suffocating, impenetrable void. Blinded and completely disoriented within the subterranean labyrinth, a sharp, cold spike of sheer panic immediately clawed at his throat. His thumb frantically ground against the flint wheel of the metal lighter, the small mechanism protesting with a harsh, scraping rasp. It yielded nothing but brief, pathetic showers of sparks that illuminated nothing and were instantly swallowed by the overwhelming, heavy blackness. The profound, dead silence of the cellar did not return. Instead, the subterranean atmosphere began to warp, giving way to an onslaught of deeply unnatural phenomena. A dry, papery rustling sound began to emanate from the damp brickwork, quickly morphing into a multitude of overlapping, sibilant whispers. The sound did not originate from a single identifiable point. Rather, it seemed to bleed from the walls, the ceiling, and the very dirt beneath his boots simultaneously, surrounding him in a dizzying, disorienting chorus. Though the overlapping voices formed no human language he could comprehend, the intent behind the harsh, raspy syllables was undeniably clear. The whispers vibrated with a palpable, ancient malice and a dire, threatening warning that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand rigidly on end. Straining his eyes against the pitch-black environment, Caleb felt his mind begin to fracture under the sensory deprivation. He sensed immediate fluid movement nearby, a shifting mass of shadow that appeared somehow denser, heavier,
and more solid than the mere absence of light, gliding soundlessly past his peripheral vision. A paralyzing primal dread, older than human logic, rooted his boots firmly to the uneven dirt floor. He held his breath, terrified that even the sound of his own racing heart might draw the full attention of whatever unseen entity now shared the suffocating cellar with him. Without warning, the freezing metal lockbox gripped tightly in his hand began to react to the surrounding darkness. A faint, sickening vibration originated from deep within its iron core, transferring a rhythmic, buzzing energy directly through the decaying leather and into his palm. The already freezing temperature of the container plummeted drastically, radiating a bone-chilling cold that shot violently up his arm, threatening to numb his fingers and force him to drop it. The sheer, unnatural horror of the vibrating object finally shattered his physical paralysis. A massive surge of adrenaline flooded his system, overriding his terror with a desperate, singular instinct to survive. Abandoning the useless lighter to the dark, Caleb operated purely on blind panic and a desperate reliance on his spatial memory. He pivoted violently, clutching the vibrating lockbox tightly to his chest alongside the leather drafting tube, and broke into a reckless, stumbling sprint toward the area where he believed the stone staircase to be. He navigated the treacherous, unseen obstacles of the cellar completely blind, his shoulders brushing against unseen wooden posts. As he ran, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to physically solidify around him, actively fighting his escape. He felt the sickening, phantom brush of something entirely unseen and repulsively gelatinous swiping through the freezing air just inches from his face. Invisible, formless appendages seemed to reach out from the suffocating depths of the shadows, making desperate, grasping passes at his churning legs, attempting to trip him and drag him down into the dirt. Simultaneously, a distinct aggressive pressure repeatedly tore at his arms and clothing, an unseen force violently intent on ripping the heavy, vibrating metal lockbox from his desperate grip before he could reach the safety of the stairs. Caleb burst through the heavy cellar door, stumbling onto the warped hardwood floor of the main foyer. The sudden, blinding intrusion of the harsh afternoon sun streaming through the shattered transom windows forced him to squeeze his eyes shut against the glare. His chest heaved violently, pulling in ragged, desperate gasps of the stagnant, dusty air of the hallway, as if it were the sweetest oxygen on earth. A cold, clammy sweat completely coated his pale face, and his heart hammered against his ribs with a frantic, punishing rhythm that echoed loudly in his ears. He did not pause to catch his breath or look back at the gaping black maw of the basement stairwell. Clutching the weathered leather drafting tube tightly under his left arm and gripping the unnaturally freezing metal lockbox in his right hand, he bolted through the grand entryway and out onto the overgrown front lawn. The oppressive summer heat immediately enveloped him, a stark and welcoming contrast to the graveyard chill he had just escaped. Mrs. Eldridge remained exactly where he had left her, sitting entirely motionless in her weathered wooden rocking chair beneath the drooping branches of the weeping willow. She appeared completely undisturbed by the passage of time, as if she had not even registered his terrifying absence or the horrific ordeal he had just endured beneath her home. Caleb marched directly toward the elderly woman, his boots crunching loudly on the dry grass. His throat was too dry and constricted with residual terror to speak, so he offered no explanation or greeting. He simply extended his trembling arm and silently presented the cursed metal lockbox to her. The old woman slowly reached out with her gnarled, arthritic fingers and accepted the heavy container. The very millisecond the aged leather and freezing iron transferred from his skin to hers, the sickening, frantic vibration within the box ceased instantly. Simultaneously, the maddening dry whispers that had continued to scratch at the edges of Caleb's sanity completely evaporated from his mind, leaving behind a ringing, profound silence that felt almost as heavy as the noise. Mrs. Eldridge slowly raised her head and met his gaze. Looking into her pale, cloudy eyes, Caleb found absolutely no trace of gratitude for his harrowing retrieval effort. Instead, he saw a bottomless well of deep, infinite sorrow mixed with a haunting, palpable sense of relief. It was the distinct look of a deeply burdened soul finally passing on an unbearable, ancient weight. She gave him a single, slow nod, a solemn gesture acknowledging that their unspoken transaction was officially complete and his debt was fully paid. Without waiting for a dismissal or uttering a single word of farewell, Caleb turned on his heel and walked stiffly toward his battered pickup truck. He forced himself to look only forward, refusing to cast a single glance back at the weeping willow, the old woman, or the decaying Gothic mansion looming behind him. He climbed into the sweltering cab, slammed the rusted metal door shut, and aggressively twisted the ignition key. The engine roared to life, and he slammed the gear shift into drive, tearing away from the ruined estate and throwing up a thick, obscuring cloud of dry summer dust. As he sped down the winding country road, back toward the safety of the modern city, he kept his eyes rigidly fixed on the asphalt straight ahead, utterly terrified of the phantom shapes he might see if he dared to look into the rearview mirror. Resting innocently on the cracked vinyl of the passenger seat beside him was the leather tube containing the priceless architectural blueprints. Caleb had ultimately secured exactly what he came for, obtaining the ultimate historical inspiration for his preservation career. Yet, as the miles stretched on, a cold knot of dread settled permanently in his stomach. He knew that for the rest of his natural life, he would be haunted by the inescapable, terrifying question of what ancient malice had been locked inside that freezing, vibrating iron box, and what terrible, unseen price he had truly paid to inherit the dark legacy of the Eldridge estate.